reading?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we'll have people popping in here. People are already coming in. You can look at the participants on the bottom.
Well, we're glad to have you all. Thank you.
We are almost set up on Facebook. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Oh, it says webinar is now streaming live on Facebook. So here we go.
It
Perfect.
does. So we'll give it a few more minutes while more people log in.
It does always happen that more people register than actually come in because people forget or life happens, but we do email the recording to everyone who signs up and post it as well.
Oh, I see. I don't see Ann Horak in here yet, so I know that people are still logging in. I see Joel. Hello. Kathleen Stout.
Now that Anne is in, does that give you comfort?
Yeah, I was just texting her. I was just saying, Anne, so she should be getting a text from me this second. Like, where are you?
She's on. She raised her hand, as I imagine, and hello is my guess. Yeah, she's commenting. Thanks, Anne.
Hi, Anne.
Anne is one of our board and committee members. So. And in the chat, we have someone that says, good evening, Michael from the Native American Agriculture Fund. Happy tribal member, I guess. Toni, do you know him? Do you know Michael?
Yep, that's my staff. We're invited to join.
Well, let me know when you want me to start. Kayla, you just let me know.
If you want to start introductions, I think that's fine. People will come and go as usual.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to YWCA's Next Courageous Conversation. My name is Dr. Sylvia Acosta, and I am the CEO of YWCA El Paso del Norte region. YWCA El Paso has been around since 1909, and our mission is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. This Courageous Conversation series has made it possible for us to share new points of view, personal stories, and impactful experiences with our community. And I am happy to have you all here this evening. Questions are welcome this evening, and our team is monitoring the question and answer and chat functions so that everyone watching can feel free to ask questions as our conversations progress. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to thank Helen of Troy, TFCU, and Enterprise. Their contributions to our racial justice and social equity programs makes events like this possible. So with that, I'm waiting, hold on. I now have the honor of introducing our panel. I'll go in alphabetical order and then we will get started. First is Dr. Michelle Hale, who is a citizen of the Navajo Nation from Oak Springs, Arizona. She is an assistant professor of American Indian Studies at Arizona State University. She served on the Native American Connections Board of Directors from 2019 through 2021, and on the Board of Trustees of the Cook Native American Ministries Foundation. Her research includes issues of tribal governance, public policy, state and tribal relations, and the role of Navajo women in grassroots activism, among many other topics. Welcome, Dr. Hale. We're glad to have you here. Next is Hanky Ortiz, who is an enrolled member of the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma and is the Associate Deputy Director of Bureau Operated Schools for the Bureau of Indian Education. She oversees all schools operated by the Bureau outside of the Navajo Nation. Previously, she served as the Deputy Bureau Director for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and holds a Juris Doctorate from the University of Montana. Thank you so much for joining us, Hanky. And last but not least is someone who I feel like I know very well. Toni Stanger-McLaughlin is a citizen of the Colville Confederated Tribes and serves as Chief Executive Officer of the Native American Agriculture Fund, which provides grants, education, and advocacy services to support Native farmers and ranchers. She has a Juris Doctorate degree from the University of North Dakota School of Law with a focus on federal Indian law. She has worked in the USDA Office of Civil Rights and the USDA Office of Tribal Relations, where she has worked to advance tribal needs in agriculture, natural resources, land use, and infrastructure development. Thank you for being here, Toni. So now we will just jump in by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about yourselves, your background, and how you got to where you are today. We'll start with Toni.
Hello, it's nice to meet everyone. My name is Water Runs Downhill, and my English name, as she said, is Toni Stanger-McLaughlin. I'm so happy to be welcomed here tonight and to have all of you participating. And for those of you that will watch at a later time, hopefully this dialogue will be beneficial to you and exploring more about our life experiences, but also the current state of some of the hot button issues that we're dealing with right now as Native women, as minority women. So welcome. I came to this position as the new CEO of the Native American Agriculture Fund as somebody who simply just wanted to make a difference. For most of my career, and I started working at a young age, it's been about getting things done. As my former CEO and founder of NAF, founding CEO of NAF used to say, we're professional problem solvers. And I think as Indigenous women and the women from my community, I come from a community where men and women are considered equal. And in that capacity, we all have our own roles, and each role is important and we cannot conduct ourselves or continue our life ways without one another. And women always had positions of leadership. So being raised in that type of community and that responsibility, it led me to be able to do and accomplish great things that I never in a million years would have thought that I would have been able to do. But I did that without the goal of having my name in a paper or having, something attached to my ego, but rather always with the outcome of how can I serve my people? How can I be respectful and responsible for the community that I represent? And that allowed me to go from a little tiny town on my reservation in the middle of nowhere to Washington, D.C. to advocate for tribes all across the country. Even as a young person, I was interviewed by our local paper. When I was still in high school, I represented my tribe as a youth ambassador as Miss Colville Confederated Tribes, which took me to actually Albuquerque, New Mexico, and where actually Santa Fe, where I ended up becoming Miss National Congress of American Indians, another ambassadorship role that ended up having a national scale. which then led me to an internship at the National Congress of American Indians, where at the time the executive director, Joanne Chase, let me know that she had a law degree, but she didn't practice law, but that was an important degree, and it would allow you to be very diverse in your future goals and endeavors and assist Indian country. And if you wanted to be, and at the time I thought eventually I would be in politics, and she said, if you want to be in politics, you have to know how to write a law. So that's where I decided I would go to law school. I took the long route, ended up becoming a non-traditional student, but eventually graduated with my law degree. And as I entered law school, I met my husband, who graduated from the University of New Mexico School of Law. And he went to DC before I did. I joined him there. And through another wonderful, powerful Native woman, I ended up working at the United States Department of Agriculture in their Civil Rights Office. And later in the newly formed Office of Tribal Relations, which had been elevated to the office of the secretary. And while there, I met Janie Hip, who was our founding CEO at the Native American Agriculture Fund. And after she left the department and went into the private sector, I followed her. I told her I would follow her until she retired. And I wish I could follow her right now. She is the new general counsel for the United States Department of Agriculture. She's the first Native woman to have this position. But again, throughout her whole career, it was done in a way to benefit the people, and oftentimes in her case, to benefit farmers and ranchers of all races, but especially those in the BIPOC community. So that, in a roundabout way, is how I came to be where I am now. I set goals until the age of 30, and I accomplished all those. And so now, as I'm, in my 40s, I'm wondering, I need to set some more goals. But in the meantime, my goal is supporting the Native American Agriculture Fund. The Native American Agriculture Fund is birthed out of litigation, actually litigation that I worked on when I was at the department. I helped settle the Keep Seagull case, and I settled the Keep Seagull opt-out cases, and was very passionate in making sure that I saw this to fruition. Even when I was 7.5 months pregnant, I traveled to cold North Dakota to do investigations to make sure that this case would be settled. And as I left, we didn't know what would happen to the leftover funding, to the settlement. Janie and I just knew that we did our best, what we could at USDA. And when we were in the private sector, we were asked to come in and help do listening sessions so that we could work with the communities that were the claimants that were affected by the discrimination that occurred against them, and let them know their options. And unfortunately, our first two options, which we were advocating, were continue the claims period, provide the funding to the claimants, and both of those were not on the table. The Department of Justice and the administration at the time said no. And the third option was the establishment of NAF, which I'm now the CEO of. And ultimately, after additional years of litigation, the trust fund was approved, and we've been in operation for 3 years, and we provide funding to 4 eligible entities. Those are educational institutions, 501c3s, and CDFIs, community financial development institutions, and tribal governments, including state governments. And our mission is to support Native farming and ranching, but that's very broad. It includes education, access to capital, small food projects, as well as large-scale production for tribes. So that is how I came to be where I am. And again, I know my ancestors would have never imagined that I would walk in the shoes that I have thus far. And I have to give them credit for where I am today.
Thank you so much, Toni, for sharing that. What an amazing story. You're so young to have done so much. So we're looking for more things from you. I'll move on to Dr. Michelle Hale, if you want to share tell us about yourself.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation this evening. I am originally from Window Rock, grew up on the Navajo Reservation, although I'm also Laguna, Chippewa, and Odawa by my mother's side of the family. Attended the University of Arizona for both my undergraduate and graduate education, and I have actually been an educator for 25 years. I can't believe how quickly time has flown. I've been teaching undergrads and graduate students, both here at Arizona State University and the University of Arizona, since the early 90s, and even did a couple summers teaching for the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, CERT, David Lester's program years ago at the University of New Mexico. So I have the great honor and pleasure of working with our young people, which is, I think a wonderful source of inspiration because they have so much energy and passion to work on issues, challenges that face our tribal communities. And something that has not changed over all these years is that real desire among our students to give back to their people, to their communities, and to do things just to help make life a little better for current and future generations. So our job really is to help them to build that toolkit through the courses that we teach, through mentoring, and even just support. Any kind of moral support we can offer our students, I think is really important in terms of that personal and professional growth. I've actually been teaching in areas of community and economic development. I also teach some of our core courses, Introduction to American Indian Studies and Federal Indian Policy, but I'm currently working on a book on Navajo community development. And hopefully, if all goes well, that book should be out in 2023 sometime. It's my first book, so everything is brand new to me in terms of writing a book. But it's something that is near and dear to my heart because it's work that I think can be really useful for people back home on the reservation. It's about culturally appropriate approaches to land use and to community development. It's all about trying to empower decision makers in our communities on the Navajo Nation, and not just people who are part of the bureaucratic system in Window Rock, but it's about local communities, the 110 chapters across the Navajo Nation, and trying to equip them with tools and information so that they can better facilitate processes of community development. We have a lot of Navajo students in our classes, and something I try to do is to bring in speakers and provide information that can help them to, again, address some of the issues that they identify in their communities. They know what the issues are, and in many cases, they have great ideas in terms of what can be done, what's realistic for the community. Oftentimes, they just need a little bit of help in terms of maybe introduction to people who can mentor them, or because I teach community development courses, I've been in a long time partnership with the School of Urban Planning. So sometimes it's about introducing GIS to our students or other tools from planning that can help them to address issues in their communities. So it's really about working across the disciplines. I've also worked with folks over in construction, design, and architecture. And the central theme, the shared interest that we have is in really helping people in our communities to indigenize planning processes, to better write land use policy so that, it's not something we just inherited from the BIA, but it's actually something that fits the community that it serves. So I go up for tenure next year. So next year is a pretty big year for me professionally. Nerve-wracking, but exciting at the same time. And, because I've been working with folks over in urban planning for the last couple of years, I've been really excited that there've been some articles that have come out just in the last year that reflect some of this work that is a partnership between American Indian Studies and urban planning. So I think there's some wonderful prospects out there right now in terms of this interdisciplinary work. And I really like to keep it relevant, practical for people back home and accessible to students we work with. So feel like we have a lot going on here. We're very proud to graduate several hundred American Indian students at every commencement. We're getting ready for commencement again in December. And we're in a place, given the state of Arizona, the fact that we have 22 federally recognized tribes here in the state, we have a real opportunity to partner with tribal communities and to help grow capacity in terms of providing the best education possible to our Indigenous students. So that about sums up what I'm doing here at ASU.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Haley. Hanky, we'd love to hear about you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hanky Ortiz, and I am a member of the Ywca tribe from Oklahoma, but I'm also Comanche and Caddo. And I grew up in Oklahoma in a small town, and I got my Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology before going on to get my Juris Doctor in law at the University of Montana. So I grew up in Oklahoma. I've lived in Montana. Work has taken me different places. I've lived in San Francisco. I lived out in DC for a while, and I worked in private practice for a couple of years, and then I became a federal attorney practicing federal Indian law. I worked for the Indian Health Service, and all my work has been in Indian law. I worked in tribal courts when I was in private practice, and then worked in federal court. And I eventually decided that I wanted to get into administration. So I shifted into administration because I really wanted to be able to write policy and direct the government in dealing with American Indians and Alaska Natives. And I feel like Indigenous people need an advocate inside the government to understand Native communities and to be able to write policies for the benefit of those people that we serve. And so a lot like Toni mentioned, I'm very service oriented. I see myself as a public servant. And I've held various positions, including self-governance director at the Indian Health Service. That's when I first became a senior executive. And then I moved on to the BIA and to my current position as the Associate Deputy Director for Bureau Operated Schools. And in this position, I oversee the off-reservation boarding schools, the 4 off-reservation boarding schools we have in BIE that we operate directly, 2 on-reservation boarding schools, a boarding dorm, and 15 day schools across the country. And so the challenges have been great with regard to the pandemic in serving our communities and providing educational services to students. So the areas I've worked in have been varied, but I've had some strong influences from some strong Native women, including my mother and my aunt and my grandmother. My grandmother was a strong advocate for education, and she always encouraged us to study and go to school and learn. And my aunt was a big proponent of education. She worked in education throughout her career. And although they're not with us any longer, I'm very proud that I work in the area of education, although it's not an area that I ever thought I would work in. And I really took a long path to get here. But I've enjoyed all of the work that I've done. I've had a long career of learning and working with tribes across the country, tribal communities in a wide variety of areas. When I was at the BIA, I oversaw all of the people programs. So I worked in social services, transportation, self-determination, tribal government services. There's a lot of different areas that I've had the pleasure of working in. And enjoy working with all the tribes and all the people in the various areas that I've worked in. So I'm really happy to be here. There are so many issues that we can discuss with regard to Indigenous people and the issues facing women. And so I'm just excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Hanky. I really appreciate it. So all of you three have incredible positions. Unfortunately, that is not how Native people are typically presented to non-Native audiences in media. What have your experiences been like as you've moved through your careers, and have you experienced anti-Indigenous racism? And we'll start with, who would like to take that? I'm going to look at Toni because she looks ready to answer that question.
Yeah, I find myself, and I've had to explain this to people, that the generations before me, a lot of them were in survival mode. And I am a part of a generation, and especially my children are part of a generation where we have choices. And we are going to be part of the thriving generation. And so for my parents, leaving the reservation was a really big deal. Unfortunately, it wasn't their choice. My dad was part of relocation, which was a policy where the federal government sent young men and women to big urban areas to civilize them. My dad took what he could from it, but ultimately his goal was to get home. And so when he finally could, they moved back to the reservation where most of my siblings and I have been raised on and off and near our reservation. But for them, it was about just getting out of poverty, getting out, growing some of the policies that were imposed on them by the federal government. And so when I meet people, I'll be on a plane, I'll be in a taxi, I'll give a presentation such as this, and then I'll have people find me on LinkedIn or other social media, and they're so shocked. And then I've had people make comments like, oh, well, you don't sound Indian, or you don't look Indian. and it's underhanded, and sometimes it's just ignorance, and I try to be respectful of that. But ultimately it means, you don't sound dumb. You speak eloquently. Well, fortunately, I'm able to walk in both worlds. And as somebody who can do that, I'm doing it in a way where I can help my people at the same time and the generations behind me. But I have a lot of those comments, and then I have a lot of people who the only statistics that they know about natives are the bad statistics. And unfortunately, we rise to the top of a lot of those statistics where they'll look at me like, oh, well, you're not an alcoholic. Well, we're not all alcoholics. We don't still live in teepees. So, and unfortunately, it's not everybody's fault. We're not in the curriculum. People don't learn about us. I have met so many taxi drivers and Uber drivers, especially when I'm back east, we're like, oh my gosh, you guys are still alive? We thought that all the cowboys killed you. And so it's not just here in the United States, it's internationally. We as a population, as less than 1% of the overall population, we are underrepresented. And there are now campaigns and organizations such as Illuminative who are trying to stand us up, and it's simple things. I've had, being back in Washington, D.C. with the mascot issue, I've had people say, well, why do you care now? Why do they have a problem with that now? Well, it's like, we probably always had a problem with it. We just were so busy surviving that we didn't have time to concentrate on these other issues. But they are important because it takes us away from that caricature, from that extinct mentality, and it brings us into this modern day where we're thriving Native Americans. We are successful. We're taking care of our people, but at the same time, we're carrying our traditions and our culture into the 21st century. And we just want others to know that.
Thank you so much for that. I can relate to a lot of that because that happens to Latinos all the time. I remember people used to say to me, you don't look Latino. What does that even mean? Hanky, do you want to speak to anti-Indigenous racism or kind of what you've experienced in your life? You're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to speak to that. And I can totally relate to what Toni is saying because, you know, well, people, when they find out you're Native, they always have questions. And, you know, sometimes you don't even want to get into the whole conversation because it's, you know, I feel like sometimes I'm constantly educating people and it's exhausting sometimes. And, you know, there are so many misconceptions out there that it's difficult to address them all and challenge them. You know, there has been racism as far as like overt racism, and you know, it's practicing law. When I first started practicing, I went to court against non-native attorneys, and you know, I even got patted on the head and like, oh, we'll help you, little lady. And you know, it's just you know, I just learned from that to always be prepared and to make, you know, being prepared, you know, helps you to win. And, you know, that you just learn from those experiences. You know, I've had a situation traveling with a friend and trying to stay at a motel on the side of the road because we were tired. That said vacancy, but then when we went in as Native people, they suddenly said they didn't have any rooms available. And you know, we said, well, their sign says it, and they said, oh, we just gave out our last room. I mean, there's just different things that happen. So there's overt racism and there's more subtle racism. And there are these preconceived notions. And it's really disappointing. I have two teenage daughters in high school right now, and they're having to deal with similar situations where one of my daughters was involved in a school activity where they were supposed to be on teams. And they were, you know, she was with these two other non-native boys, and they wouldn't even include her in the conversation. And, you know, they wouldn't listen to her ideas. And so she had to find a way to advocate for herself. And, you know, I think that's what we've had to do too, is find ways to advocate for ourselves, but also become advocates for people who can't advocate for themselves. So in my case, it's been for healthcare for Native people, for education for Native people, and, you know, whatever area that we're working in, you know, because we find the words and we're able to overcome those challenges and become advocates, that I think makes us stronger and stronger advocates for other people.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hale, do you want to take this question?
Sure. I was once told that I speak like a white girl by a homeless guy in downtown Phoenix. And it was interesting because the catcalling went from something that was clearly, you know, fetish, Indian princess sort of thing, to when my friends and I came upon him and we were talking and this guy heard me speaking, you know, it switched, and then he was kind of mad about it and said that I sound like a white girl. But you know, I think it's interesting that given many of the choices that I've made and my husband and I have made, in that you know, it just kind of don't fit the mold in a lot of ways. I waited until I was in my 40s to get married. My husband and I do not have children. When I was in high school, I attended a Catholic school, which was very different from a lot of others in my community. So, you know, and I was a bit of a non-traditional student. I took the scenic route through graduate school and you know, was a little older than some of my peers. So it's been an interesting journey along the way, just not always kind of fitting the mold or expectations that I think people often want to place upon me or place upon us as Native women. I think here in the state of Arizona, it's interesting how, given how many tribal communities there are in our state, and given, especially here in Phoenix, the proximity of tribal communities, and you know, you look at census numbers and see just how many thousands of Indigenous people there are in the Phoenix metropolitan area, how we still manage to be very invisible. And, you know, a lot of times people, their only awareness of Native communities is the fact that they see casinos, or they know that there's a concert venue that's on a tribal community, or if we happen to be in the news, it's about the gaming compact. It's, you know, as was stated earlier, oftentimes it's the negative headlines, it's negative information that people know about our people. And sometimes it's, I think people will then take a broad brush in terms of how they see us as Indigenous communities. So I know in working with students that students will say that non-Indigenous students will be in our classes and say, you know, they were born and raised in Phoenix and they kind of know that there are tribes in the area, but maybe they feel like the reservation is a big black hole and don't know much about tribes, just that we're adamant about protecting sovereignty, or that casinos are huge money makers, but then they can't figure out why then we're so poor if everybody's making money hand over fist with casinos. So a lot of it is about education. It's about addressing those stereotypes. It's about trying to unravel some of the ignorance. I've known people, because I teach a policy class and often take students to the Capitol to meet legislators. Legislators will say, you know, 99% of their job is education, trying to explain everything from tribal economies, infrastructure issues, public health concerns to fellow legislators, which means before they can even get to the point of having policy conversations, they're having to educate fellow lawmakers about what's going on in tribal communities. And again, some of that is combating stereotypes, trying to clear up misunderstanding, misinformation, but they persevere. And you know, as an educator, I know that requires a lot of patience. And sometimes it means going all the way back to square one in terms of answering some of those basic questions about history, about the reservation system, about how tribes govern. And even for people who say, well, you know, Indians are always so caught up in their sovereignty, it's about having that conversation about, well, what does that really mean? And explaining that, you know, every tribe is different, and what sovereignty means to Navajo Nation is going to be different from Hopi, different from San Carlos Apache, so on and so forth. So, you know, thankfully, I think I'm an optimist, and some of the bright spots are that given, you know, the ignorance that is out there, there are also some very well-meaning people who are open-minded and willing to learn, and you know, kind of thoughtful in terms of how they take in information that is shared with them. So I think, you know, education really does matter, but it does require some patience.
Right. So, you know, some of the things that have been touched on tonight have been stereotypes, fetishizing, the patriarchy, because we can't forget that, you know, and then really racism as well. So as you look at all of these issues and all of the things that you have to deal with as Native women, as professional women, what do you think, and what would you consider the top issues being for Native Americans at this time, for Indigenous communities at this time? And that's a very loaded question because there are so many things that you can answer. But I'd like for you to think about, for women, like think about maybe what the top choice would be for women, and then maybe for communities, for your particular communities. So I'll go ahead and start with Hanky on that question.
You're right. There's so many answer to that question, but I think one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now is the historical erasure of American Indians and the exclusion. You know, we have been excluded from history, and so there's that kind of facilitates the lack of understanding. And you know, we've not really learned about the impacts of colonialism and how that carries on into today, and to how we are dealing with so many different issues. So there's so many stories that, you know, historically, there were tribes all over the United States, all over the country that we're in now. And, you know, that's never explained. We had roadways, we had trade routes, there was so much happening. And, you know, we had our own cultures and traditions and communities and interactions with each other, you know, within our communities and with other tribal communities. And, you know, that there's just so much that lack of understanding leads to some of these these false beliefs, and so that kind of facilitates a lot of other issues. So I think that's a big problem. You know, that's led to disparities that we're dealing with right now in all different areas, particularly in you know, in education, in jobs, and you know, a lot of other issues that we have to deal with. Right now, during the pandemic, I think Native communities have been hit really hard with depression and a loss of life, and dealing with losing loved ones or being ill or caring for someone that's ill. Native communities have really been hit hard during this pandemic, and we're seeing increased instances of depression and suicide. And so those are very challenging behavioral health issues that you know, stem from, you know, not just what we're dealing with today, but things that we've carried on from the past. And so those are some big challenges that we're dealing with right now, I think. And you know, that I think I'm starting to see a push for education on Indigenous people in this country, and you know, the role that we actually played in history, and having, you know, that transition, I think, is really good. And I know, you know, helping young people to understand who they are, where they come from, and to be proud of that history and that culture that identifies them and that is a part of them, I think, you know, will be helpful as we move forward into the future. But there are so many other challenges that you know, there's so many things we could talk about, but I think those, for me, those right now are the biggest challenges that I think we're facing.
Dr. Hale, what is your opinion on that question in terms of the biggest challenges for Native people, Indigenous people, and Indigenous women?
I think that a challenge that is ongoing is civic participation. And that includes everything from accessibility for Indigenous people who are interested in running for office on all levels, county, state office, well, tribal office, but also all the way up to serving in Washington, D.C. I think there's new attention on voter access for Indigenous populations. Some of that is wrapped up in larger voter access concerns across the country for other communities of color. But I think in tribal communities, we've for a long time had issues with that. Of course, varies state to state, but hasn't always been on the radar screen. And it's something that in some communities, when you have issues, for example, with maybe elderly voters who for whom English is a second language, you know, we have a lot of that at Navajo, or who don't have birth certificates to be able to have the right ID to cast a ballot. Those have been long-standing issues. I think students, again, bringing it back to the youth, they're really fired up about a lot of the social justice issues that our whole country has been talking about in the last 2 years. But it's good to see that students are bringing attention to the facet of the social justice issues that are about our people, our communities, Indigenous issues. And that includes everything from missing and murdered Indigenous women to the mascot issue. You know, there have been some really strong and verbal people out there drawing attention to these issues. So I think that engagement in the national conversation, but also transferring that to engagement, whether that means people are organizing locally to continue to draw attention to these issues, or they're getting involved with campaigns to support candidates who are again drawing attention to these issues. There are lots of opportunities out there, and I think it's important to support those across the board. I think we've been seeing some amazing headway by Indigenous people, women in particular, who have successfully run for office, both on the national and local levels. And you know, it's exciting to hear students talk about similar aspirations in terms of breaking into leadership, not just in a tribal realm, but on these other in these other areas, to be able to try to affect change for our communities. In terms of women, I think certainly there are a lot of women in Indigenous communities who are heads of household for single parent homes, and women who are taking care of elderly members of the family. For a long time, women have outnumbered men in terms of enrollment in graduate and professional programs. So, you know, there are a lot of women carrying a lot of responsibility out there, and I think it's important to continue to support them in any way we can, whether that's moral support, whether it's helping a student with a grant so that they're not taking on student loans, whether it's connecting them to other professionals, networking so that they can you know, meet people and connect to get things done. All of those things can truly make a difference.
Thank you so much. Toni, your thoughts on this?
Wow, so many thoughts because I'm dealing with so many of these issues right now. But one thing that I realized, and actually it's been 2 years ago now, I was at a conference, and a younger woman who I work with was in the hallway late at night, and another man approached her, and he's older, and he told her, come here, I want a hug. And they were the only ones in the hall, and it totally made her feel uncomfortable and threatened. And she tried to say no, and he kind of forced himself on her. And then she went to her room, and she's like, now he knows where my room is. Well, then she was so upset about it. The next day she brought it up. And I just immediately felt guilty. And it was the first time it hit me in the face that I am part of the generation that let that happen. I'm part of the generation who brush off, you know, creepy vibes, especially by older men, and just laugh it off and make them think it's okay. And immediately I said, you know what, I am gonna not do that anymore. I have to stand up for myself so that they don't have to stand up for themselves anymore. That it means no, those types of things are not okay. And that's in one area, but it also bleeds into other areas, into your professional area, into education. Every facet of your life, there is a time where our generations have to stop and say no, and what the expectations are, and fight for our rights and fight for our presence across the board. And since that happened in 2 years, or before COVID, 2 years ago, I think it was one of my last trips before we all got shut down, I've really made a concerted effort to voice when something happens that normally I would brush off, and say, no, that's not okay. And actually call people on it. And yeah, makes them feel uncomfortable, but it means they won't do it again. And if we continue to do that, then we'll make it better for the generations behind us. And so for me, that's one of the biggest things that I've been doing in my daily life. The other thing is I'm not venting, I'm not, complaining, but I'm telling my husband when things happen to me, and telling my sons the expectations I have of them, my brothers, my father, my uncles, everyone's hearing about it now, because things that, again, you have to draw a line in the sand. This is the expectation. This is the respect that I deserve. And there have been so many instances also where it finally hit, and especially for my husband, where I'm like, things that happen to me in meetings, and I'm like, would anyone ever say that to you? And no, the answer is no. They would never even think to say that to him. A couple of really small examples. So I was in a meeting, and mostly men, and we're in a Zoom platform. It's virtual, and someone asked a question and it was ridiculous. And I shook my head no. I didn't interrupt. I just, no, like, let's move on to the next thing. And then he had to say, well, go ahead and shake your head. But men were shaking their head too. He just made it a point to call me out. And then another man said, well, basically don't show any displeasure, because you're just gonna, like, I'm the one being difficult. Don't be difficult. And so many times, little things like that, but you know what? It takes away from the equilibrium in the room and the atmosphere. And I don't have to ask permission for this facial expression, for communicating. And yet the females are constantly being told to act a certain way, to smile, to, all these things that you see in the news now. Like, I'm not here for somebody else's pleasure. I'm here to get things done. And if I come across as stern, or the B word is often thrown at us, then I'm sorry, you're just going to have to deal with it, and you're going to have to sit in your own discomfort, because my daughter's not going to have to do that when she's sitting in my seat someday.
Those are such powerful statements, because I think as women, we all go through that, and we've all had that experience where the way that we relay information is often looked at and picked apart, because it is a woman displaying displeasure. And so I think that's something we can all relate to. So one of the things that we're running out of time, so we only have 10 minutes, but I want to get to this very important question. So it should be common knowledge that the histories of Indigenous people are typically whitewashed and frequently erased altogether. This includes the American myth of the first Thanksgiving. I have to bring this up because this is November. It is well documented that the relationship between the people indigenous to this continent and the European immigrants was purposefully devastating to Native Americans. What do you believe more people should know about this history? And can you comment on what that means to you personally? And I'll start with you, Hanky.
To me personally, I recognize the real history and understand that there were situations where Indigenous people did, help colonists and help colonizers across the country, and then had them turn on them. There are stories of, after they learned how to grow food and feed themselves and survive in a world that they didn't know how to live in, that they turned around and, there were, Indigenous people were murdered. And I mean, it's really gruesome but heads were put on stakes and, sitting right outside of where they're eating, they're celebrating. And, those stories are hard to tell. People don't know those stories generally. but I think that whole story is, again, it's just like you said, it's a whitewashed version of what really happened. And those are the kind of myths that I think that we need to expel, and we can do that through education and sharing of real stories, and providing real information. And you know that story is told over and over again. I mean, we've had kids go through school and had to act it out in different forms and things like that. So, I mean, it's really embedded in American culture, and to debunk that myth is really a challenge, like I mentioned earlier. And but I think for me personally too, I also think of Thanksgiving as a time to give thanks for the blessings that we have, the family, the fact that we're still here. We've been through all of these challenges. Indigenous people in the United States have dealt with genocide, uh, termination, relocation, and we're still here, and we are becoming, we're still able to have a voice. We do have tribes, and tribes still have sovereign, their tribal sovereignty, which I heard Michelle mention earlier. That's the ability for tribes to make decisions for themselves. And I think giving thanks that we still have a lot of our culture and traditions, and we're able to celebrate with our families. And we're here because our ancestors were here, and we have to give thanks for that. They went through some really egregious situations and hard lives, and but they were strong, and because they were strong, we can be strong. So having, being thankful for those kinds of things is usually what I think about at Thanksgiving.
Thank you for that. So we have about 3 minutes left. Before we go, I'd love to have everybody answer this question if you want to answer this question. But another thing, just as we close this out, we have about 3 minutes. I'd love for each of you to spend a minute and maybe share something that maybe I didn't ask a question about, or if you wanted to answer this particular question I asked earlier, please go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Toni and let you share any thoughts you might have.
One of the things that touched me during earlier conversation, especially with Michelle as an educator, I remember being in law school and we were talking about constitutional rights, and I was one of only 3 minorities in the whole class, and somebody got up and said, well, I just think anytime I see a brown person that they're here because of affirmative action, like they don't deserve to be here, that somebody else should be sitting in their seat. And then everyone was chiming in and shaking their heads and agreeing. And how uncomfortable, how hurtful would that be for you to be the minority in that classroom? When I'm looking at my roommate who actually made the comment, who I lived with, we had the same LSAT score. So think about your students, and this is across elementary school, primary school, think about what your students are dealing with and the burden that they have to deal with every day. And again, as we've said, it's taxing having to educate people every single day. Take it upon yourselves. For those allies that are going to view this or are online with us now, learn, Google. You have a dictionary, you have videos on your phone now. You don't have to go to a library. You can just Google it, find out. One of my best friends asked me today, what's this thing about land acknowledgement? Why is it important? Well, it's important because it's been forgotten, and we need to remember that. The whole world needs to remember who we are and where we came from, and that we're still here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. Hale, you're going to have the last word.
Okay, I just want to echo what Hanky mentioned. Well, and Toni, that I think it's important that everyone knows that we're still here. Before we started our session this evening, I was listening in on a panel that our students put together called Not Thanksgiving, and it really was about trying to share the Indigenous perspective on Thanksgiving and hearing them share their personal stories and talk about how Even today, they are in classrooms with people who thought Native Americans were killed off in, the 1800s and can't believe that tribes are still around. So, the need to clear that up, to educate, I think continues. I just want to mention that I think in terms of Thanksgiving, some of the current work in food sovereignty has been a great way to add to that narrative in terms of what Thanksgiving is about, because it places a positive spotlight on traditional foods, food systems, and the resilience and survival of many of our communities in this great tradition of food in our societies. And I think it's because given the climate, when people are speaking out against critical race theory and trying to squash these opportunities to teach other perspectives on history, I think food sovereignty, because it's about these traditional foods and understanding how people nourish their bodies and survived. People have been open to considering the importance of our food systems, and it offers a different perspective on Thanksgiving. I agree with Hanky that a lot of our communities, Thanksgiving, aside from the politics of it, is a great time to bring our families together, to be grateful, and to really celebrate that togetherness. And oftentimes, it's a great time to put our traditional foods on the table.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank Toni, Michelle, and Hanky for being with us today, for participating in our courageous conversations. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined us to listen to this, and those people that will be downloading it later. Thank you all very, very much for your work, for your voices, and we send you good thoughts and hope that you continue to elevate those voices, because it is all of our voices together that can make a difference. With that, I'd like to thank everybody, and I'd like to wish everybody a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.